It's Sunday, February 5, 2023. Welcome to the 50th episode of The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. Please also subscribe to my 5-Minute News Daily Briefing podcast on iTunes or wherever you get yours. Joining us today is founder and publisher of Courier Newsroom, a network of progressive local newsrooms in 8 states across the country. Tara McGowan, welcome to The Weekend Show.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. It's a great privilege to be on your 50th show. Congratulations.
I know, right? It's kind of a special thing. If I'd have known in advance, I would put some flags up or something. We have something in common in as much as we've both kind of set up news organizations to fill a gap in the market. I started 5-Minute News just as a little podcast because I was like, wow, where are people like getting real non-biased or unbiased, non-partisan news from? Tell us a little bit about your organization and how it came to fruition.
Sure. And I'm sure that we came at this about very similar ways and for similar reasons, but I started Courier Newsroom in 2019. I was a former journalist, and then I spent a good number of years in progressive politics and advocacy work, running digital programs. And there were a few different layers to why, sort of layered reasons as to why I started Courier. One of them was I spent about 10 years running massive multi-million-dollar political advertising campaigns to support progressive causes and candidates online, on social media, and on the internet. And I was very close to the strategic playbook on the left for communicating to voters, and was very frustrated by how political electoral cycle driven investments and communications were, whereas the other side had built their own media infrastructure that they more often than not used to spread lies and disinformation. And of course, we have a mainstream media that lives in a defensive posture about being called liberal or having a liberal bias. So instead, they present false equivalencies between facts and lies all the time. And so Democrats and progressives were leaning entirely on short-term advertising on television and the internet and snail mail to get their message across, and increasingly to just get the facts across to different groups of voters and citizens. And so I felt that there was a very glaring gap in the media infrastructure, and that there needed to be more explicitly, transparently progressive news that could be built in the vein of our values. We would never compromise truth. We fact check everything. And yet we have to be able to communicate our values and what we stand for and our accomplishments to people, because no one else is going to if we don't. And the right really does understand that. And I think they weaponize that in ways that are immoral and unethical. And not ways certainly we ever would at Courier Newsroom, and don't. But there is a very long-standing history of partisan and ideological and advocacy-driven media here and abroad. I don't think there's anything nefarious about that. I think what is dangerous is when it is abused or weaponized, and truth and facts and integrity and morals and ethics are not upheld. So I built Courier to be in line with our values, and to also reach people and try to increase their awareness and agency about how they can become empowered and informed and active citizens in our democracy at a time when we need it so much. So that was the genesis for it. Our audience is very specific, and I'm sure very similar to you, because your podcast is similar to our approach to content in the way that you need to meet people where they are. For you, right? That was audio and increasingly video. We do a lot of that too, but also the way that they consume information. We have no attention spans any longer. And
well, that's why mine's called 5-Minute News.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's the whole reason.
That's exactly right. And at Courier, our newsrooms, our reporters produce very digestible video, visual, and skimmable copywritten content. So our audience are passive news consumers, which is most Americans. They don't read long articles. In fact, they don't go to websites often. They don't leave their social media news feeds. So how do you get good, factual, and progressive information across in a way that they will actually absorb it? And so I really think that we are setting new precedents in local news in particular, which has been very slow to evolve to the decentralized and very online media environment we live in today.
I want to talk about this kind of crossing the Rubicon of truth and how it is possible, because it's kind of an elephant in the room, right? To say it's a progressive news organization, but it's also purporting to tell the truth. Now, in modern America, people would say that the truth is, well, that's your truth, or that's your truth on that side or on that side. And where I come from in the UK, I grew up learning how to do the news, and it has to be truthful because it's regulated, government regulated, and the organization will lose its license to broadcast if it isn't telling the truth. And Americans don't understand that. Like, well, if the government's regulating it and it's a Labour government or a Conservative government, then and it's like, no, this, journalism exists outside of government. And that's why I would argue that, things like Fox are not journalism. They are entertainment, but they just sit on the EPG in the kind of news section, and that is kind of confusing. And let's just use an example. And that is that on Friday there was an announcement about the jobs numbers, 517,000 new jobs added in January. Economy's looking pretty strong, although the Fed keep raising interest rates, which is not a great idea, but we'll come to that. But all the news organizations were reporting this great news for the US, the fact that the economy is stronger than it's ever been. This jobs number has not been seen for like 40 years. This is unprecedented. And yet, right-wing media, Fox, Newsmax, One America, and I guess all of the talk channels, and of course the printed publications, won't mention it. They don't mention it. They talk about a fear of recession. They try and twist it so that, Biden's doing a bad job. Who does this serve? It doesn't benefit anybody. It makes 70 million Trump voters who might be watching Fox at one point or another think that they're living in a country that is sinking, that is a disaster, when in fact things are pretty good, right?
Yeah, well, I think the issue is that I believe right-wing media outlets like Fox News do believe it benefits them to hide the truth about the economy and how well it is going right now under the Biden administration and Democrats and a handful of Republicans who voted for the infrastructure bill that is creating enormous amounts of jobs and will promote economic prosperity in states across the country. But the right-wing media does have an agenda, and that agenda is to do anything and everything they can to make Democrats look bad in the interest of building political power. And they've been quite successful at that over the past number of decades in certain respects. And they are, they're coming up from behind right now a little bit. They didn't do as well as they certainly hoped, or as history might suggest in the midterms. But this is where we have such a crisis when it comes to information in America today, because we don't have regulated media in large part. And it is Fox has presented itself as news. Like their tagline, my entire life has been fair and balanced. It's a joke, right? It's a parody because they aren't fair, they aren't balanced, and they aren't honest. More often than not. And so they are pursuing a political agenda. And so, we saw the same thing with January 6th hearings. They were all over the national media in America, on every cable news and local news station outside of Fox News. It was practically.
How do you, with a progressive news organization, and me with an unbiased kind of fact-based news channel, how do we reach Republicans who were otherwise watching these channels? Because, part of the problem with US media is it's preaching to the converted. And people are very good at, joining the clan, whether it be on the left or the right, and you could call them cults, or you could call them, as Fox News do, they refer to them as each other as the family, as I discovered on this show last week. So just explain to me about what efforts you have gone to reach the people that otherwise would be falling foul of misinformation.
Sure. So at Courier, we made a very explicit decision to not try to meet what I refer to as the Kool-Aid drinkers on the right. And those are the folks that, they have Fox News playing in their house 24/7. I know folks like this. I have friends whose relatives and parents they have lost to the foxhole. as we call it, they are, in my opinion, too far gone with the exception of de-radicalization strategies and tactics and outreach that are far above my pay grade or understanding or expertise level. I believe that you've had on the author of The Cult of Trump. I really do believe that there are a lot of people that have been lost to the cult-like sort of tribalizing approach, and frankly successful approach that outlets like Fox News have taken. That said, Fox News, Tucker Carlson on his best night has a couple million viewers. This country is nearing 400 million in terms of population. So while they do seem to have an outsized impact sometimes on the national discourse and political debate, it's often because the mainstream media is taking their bait and turning manufactured stories and controversies into national news. And so that's one challenge. So what we chose to do at Courier was actually focus on the tens of millions of Americans who don't watch Fox News, who don't watch MSNBC or CNN, who are getting their news and information online, and who share our values, which are popular values. They have been labeled as progressive or even socialist by the right, but desire for meaningful gun control, action on climate change, abortion access in this country. These are things that over 70% of the American population want and are not being represented by over 70% of our elected officials.
And it's not even being mentioned on MSNBC. I mean, they don't talk about the kind of the popular thinking, because I always refer to the US as a very progressive country because I believe the people are, but the representatives aren't. And I said this a couple of weeks ago talking about gun control. There is zero appetite from elected representatives on the right to do anything about it. Mm-hmm. And yet, if you were to survey the wider population, everybody knows that school shootings are bad, more gun sales are the cause of that. So I'm really interested in how we reach people rather than this. It's almost like there's a whole fake parallel universe going on that is American media, that has no bearing on reality. And there are people staying home scared to leave the house because the news is telling them that, there's a balloon in the sky and it's taking photographs of you.
That's right. I don't know if you want to go down this rabbit hole, but I certainly can, about what I think are the really, really misaligned business incentives and interests of media companies. We live in a disinformation economy. We live in an economy that preys on people's emotions and what is going to trigger their emotions to drive more clicks and engagement, right? It plays to our worst sides as humans and human psychology, right? The interest in conspiracy theories and salacious content or celebrity gossip or drama, right? These things kind of play at our kind of worst sides in certain ways.
And it's all revenue. Let's be clear. So everything you just mentioned is just cash dollars. Every emotion that we have can be encapsulated by Facebook or captured by YouTube or whatever to create revenue.
All of these problems to me, all of these crises at a national level, but also a global level, it always stems to me from unregulated capitalism. And right. I really do think that, I believe in capitalism. I think, though, that the way that it needs to function for the best of us and for the best of our ideals in America is if it is regulated, right? Yeah. The Republican Party, today's Republican Party, does not believe in any regulation. They do not believe in any government intervention when it comes down to it, unless they are controlling the government and choose what they want to do with that power.
And they've even used the word deregulation as a good thing, right? So that word has been weaponized, smaller government deregulation. And the reality of that is that you end up with companies putting goodness only knows what into the water system, right?
That's right. Well, and that's what they've also done, is they've equated deregulation with pro-business. So people choose, right? Oh, I'm pro-business, so I am for deregulation, where actually we should have a pro-business, pro-worker economy that is for regulation, because regulation is how we are going to ensure more fairness, more equity, more accountability, and frankly, more progress. For a more prosperous nation that helps everybody have equal access to opportunity. And so that's another issue. And again, it kind of comes back to the right being operating at a much higher level of narrative intervention than the left in America often does. The left is focused on policy and solutions, and communicating those things is
and detail.
And detail.
Yeah.
And good governance, making sure government does things and delivers for people. And I am not saying the Democratic Party is perfect by any means in this country. I have a number of criticisms about it. But I will say, just looking at the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress and the Senate over the past 2 years, they have accomplished historic, unbelievably significant pieces of legislation they have passed that are going to have tremendous implications and already are on our economy, on public health care, on climate change, mitigation. And so I think that, oftentimes when you have your head down doing the work, sometimes you forget to tell the right story about that. And when the other side has absolutely no interest in accomplishing anything for the majority of people, they spend a lot of time thinking about how to craft a story that's going to get people to vote in their direction based entirely on fiction. And
all of the good stuff, whether it be the jobs numbers announced on Friday, or whether it be, the economy being buoyant, the country being safe, there are things that obviously people are doing on the ground level. Everybody is trying to do their best, but they're doing their best, and civil servants are doing their best for the entire populace. This is, I guess, what, when you politicize everything, you forget that a firefighter has to do the same for a Republican who's burning in a building as a Democrat burning in a building. And that message doesn't seem to be communicated, in my view, enough to the public, through the news, or even through, let's say, the podium in the White House press room. Why is it like one rule for one side and one rule for another side? And we've seen this week. If I could just quickly, sorry to talk so much, but to mention this story that has been kind of making the headlines this week about Ilhan Omar. And the House of Representative Republicans on Thursday, I think it was, they ousted her from the high-profile committee over remarks widely condemned as anti-Semitic that she apologized for. 2 years after Democrats removed 2 Republicans from committee assignments for being extremists. I mean, this story is another example of how it's like one rule for one side and another rule for the other. And the media should be doing a better job of exposing that and saying this is not true, or this is the detail of this subject. And Joe Biden should be doing it, and Karine Jean-Pierre should be doing it. And I'm not hearing it, and that's only making people more scared and more angry and more divided. You're touching on such a good point and such an issue that I don't know that I have an answer on how to resolve. But, there is this understanding in communications, and I think I've seen this out of the Biden administration quite a bit, where, there is an interest in not providing more oxygen to a story that, you don't trust the reporters are going to get right either way because of how they cover these things. And so they don't want to spend more time giving it more attention when there are bigger things to talk about, including economic policies and policies that are going to help people and achievements that are now coming to fruition in communities across the country. So I think that's one piece of it, that you're not, getting the constant punching back and debunking of this stuff, because sometimes it just feels like it's actually going to be more effective and strategic to talk about the things you want to talk about. But where that falls apart is when you do have massive networks and channels and properties on the right, that they're going to they're going to beat that drum for their audiences and their supporters every day, and there isn't a counter narrative that reaches them. So that kind of gets back to your earlier question about how do we reach people with other information than the right-wing media. And you have to understand, if you are in the business of news or media today, that you don't build something and people come. There is a very, very tiny percentage of this population that actually proactively looks for and consumes good news and information every day. Yeah. You have to go to these audiences. And when you do, which we've done enormous amounts of testing and learning at Courier and my previous organization, Acronym, when you inject factual news and headlines, whether it's from the New York Times, which they might hate if they were asked on a survey, or the Wall Street Journal, or any of our news outlets, when you put that into their news feeds through targeting or other strategies, they are informed by it. They're just not going to go look for it.
And there isn't even really immediate criticism of where it came from, which is how we are in this mess to begin with disinformation. So in a lot of ways, it's a share of voice challenge. And we think about this all the time and put this into operation all the time at Courier, where we really believe in Steve Bannon's very effective strategy of flood the zone, because when they are the only ones flooding the zone, that is the only information that reaches people, and it has a downstream and ripple effect beyond their core audiences. And there is not enough good information that is intentionally reaching these populations who are not going to pay the New York Times paywall, who are not going to listen to NPR every day in their community, where you actually have to go to them and put that information in front of them and make it relevant to them. That's the other problem in our national media today too, is political reporting is very much reported for and to and by elites. It's just a fact. They are increasingly out of touch with how most Americans live their lives and think about these issues. I heard, I believe it was my attorney general in Rhode Island on NPR this morning giving an interview where he was talking about messaging related to the economy. And it's like a lot of people are not hearing about jobs numbers and equating that to their lives. They want to know how and where they're going to get a job. And that's how we think about it at Courier, is interview the people who have gotten a job, right, from these economic grants and these infrastructure grants and projects that are coming online, and then back into how this came to be and who's responsible for it and what that debate is. Don't lead with
this goes back to the very nature of public service. What is public service? And public service broadcasting or public service media, I guess, in the US has kind of fallen foul of donors and of sponsorships, because they need to run and they need to and you need to pay people properly as well. That's the other thing. And I started doing 5-minute news as a passion project, and I continue to, but I'm struggling to how do I monetize this, because I don't want to take money from organizations, because, even if you try and choose a sponsor that on the face of it seems like it's entirely legitimate, you then find out that they're using child labor in Indonesia to pay for their, to make their products. And you're like, well, I just can't do that. So I would rather not be sponsored. In fact, I'm in the process of setting up a Patreon, and that really seems to be the best way to monetize independent journalism and the type of stuff that you and I are doing, where you actually reach out to your very readers or viewers or customers, and you say, look, if you want to see this and if you believe that this is of use to you, then please support it.
That's right. But then the conundrum there, Anthony, is then you're only giving information who proactively want that information, right?
Yeah. But you're still doing the information, you're still putting it out there.
Absolutely.
And not everybody has to subscribe. Not everybody has to support you.
I was going to say, you can't gate all of it, because then it contributes to the information divide and gap. Because we don't have that cultural awareness or entrenched belief yet in this country, because information has always been widely free and continues to be on the internet and social media, that there is not this tradition of paying for good information. And I do think that there's a lot of good things happening in the journalism and sort of saving journalism space in America, where it is, how can we subsidize? So good information is free and accessible to populations who won't pay for it by the people who do understand the value and will pay for it. But I also think it comes down to just a transition in the industry where we need to rely more on philanthropy, and that is not a bad thing, as long as we continue to uphold transparency, which is really important, of who backs you and what those, firewalls or those things you have in place are between the people, your corporate sponsors or your individual philanthropic billionaires. I mean, Courier, we are transparent about our investors. I have 2 billionaires that gave me the investment and are on my cap table to make this a reality without an interest in a financial return, because they believe in the good work that we're doing. And so that is a shift. And I think it's an important one, because if you have to make money off of your good information, you inevitably are going to start limiting who is reached by it, or be beholden to different interests. It's just the reality. And so I really do believe in this movement of nonprofit, philanthropically funded journalism. There's also efforts to lobby for government funding to support local news in the Fourth Estate, which I think is really important and long overdue in this country. And I know that it is a controversial topic and a fraught decision, but I do think that the UK and other countries have shown a model of where this is successful and creates really good media that can still hold and should, because it is their responsibility, the government accountable, regardless of who's in power.
Let's talk about Newsmax, because there's been a whole lot of noise about this in the last few days. Complaints from the right that AT&T, who own DirecTV, though they have a 70% share of DirecTV, they've dumped Newsmax. They're saying because it doesn't have enough viewers and they can't afford the fees and all this kind of stuff. But what I found most interesting about this was the reaction from people on the right who were making claims about Newsmax, saying, we need people to have the facts, we need people to be able to have direct access. And in fact, one person, it might have been Ted Cruz, I think, said, or even Kevin McCarthy, said something along the lines of, people need to know exactly what the Republican Party are up to. And it's like, wow, you are literally admitting that this news channel is a mouthpiece for your political party. They are as blatant and as open about it as that. Now, I've watched Newsmax and I watch all of these right-wing channels and I'm aghast, genuinely, because they serve nobody, as we've said. The fear-mongering and the bad news and Hunter Biden's laptop and all this stuff, it's like there's a whole lovely life that you can live if you live in reality. There's a really, this is a beautiful country. It has some of the most incredible landscape, has some of the greatest people. You really can prosper. The economy of this country is such that if you have a good idea and you go out and set up a business, I don't know, cleaning windows or selling ice cream, you will likely succeed because there are enough customers to serve. And it's not like that where I come from. We have poverty wages and we live under austerity in the UK, and it's pretty depressing. But the US is not like that. And I just wish that these channels that claim to be patriotic and for freedom and all of these words that have been weaponized by the right actually kind of walked the walk and talked the talk, because all I see is them talking down the country. And that is why AT&T should take them off their channels, surely.
Absolutely. I was smirking and giggling inside in my head at the beginning of you explaining this story, because there's also such extraordinary hypocrisy in their argument about this, because the company that has decided to drop Newsmax is a private corporation in America that can make those decisions. Back to our conversation about capitalism and unregulated capitalism, like they are crying afoul about a corporation making this decision to drop it, which is absolutely their,
They did the same about Twitter when they banned Donald Trump, right?
Absolutely.
And these are all private entities, and yet there is this kind of weird blurred line between what is public and in the public interest and then just a private company who happens to have a social media site.
Right. That's exactly right. And so they pick and choose based on their own interests. They want Newsmax to exist because Newsmax is an important weapon for them that continues to feed people this junk and these lies and this very negative portrayal that is often based in lies and fiction of our country, because they are trying to bring them along into their movement to bring the systems that currently exist down. It is a very strategic operation to build media like Newsmax and to paint the country and government and Democrats in a very specific light to build support for alternatives that they present that are often also lies. And I just think that we can't lose sight of that, because they have done the conservative movement in America. And now we have different breeds of it. MAGA Republicans are not like the Republicans I grew up with when I was a child. Certainly, those look really good now in retrospect to our Republican Party today. But they have run a very successful multi-decade year effort to decrease trust in government, to sow mistrust in government in America. And this is out of a fascism playbook. When people no longer trust government or institutions, they do not see them as effective. They do not see them as representative of them. They hear about no good, only bad and corruption, right? They start to really trust the people that are feeding them that information every day. Those people become very powerful, and they become the ones who are turned to for the alternative or the solution. This is what Trump did. This is what Republicans have done in America my entire life. And so they really benefit from making people believe that the government does nothing good for them. And that is something that we, again, our newsrooms, we pride ourselves in talking about the good that government and elected officials do when they do good. It doesn't mean that you don't talk about the corruption where it exists. But if we're never talking about the good things the government does, to your point about the job numbers, et cetera, and we're not doing it in a way that is relevant to Americans, those narratives will always drown out any economic policy conversations or job number reports, because it's a better, more entertaining story, what they are telling. And it plays to people's own insecurities and fears, and frankly, their lived experiences of not feeling represented. So they weaponize this, and they weaponize populism in a lot of ways in order to advance their own agenda and to build power that they will use to only benefit the very wealthy few in this country.
The free press is baked into democracy. They are connected. You need a free press to bring balance to a democracy. Now, as we know, Trump branded the press the enemy of the people and fake and all of this stuff, which is more damaging than a lot of the stuff he said, in my view, because, the free press represents everybody. And, this is a problem, isn't it? The idea that democracy, as you have just described it, there isn't really an appetite for democracy anymore on the right, not just with the elected representatives, but actually with the people that are following them. They've started to be brainwashed, because I've actually seen it in the last few years. And I suppose the insurrection was really the kind of, very much the pinnacle of that, was that, well, why do we need the IRS? Why do we need the FBI? Why do we need NATO? Why do we need any of these organizations that keep us safe? I mean, this is really dangerous, Tara.
Incredibly dangerous. And it is, I get this feeling in my stomach when the conversation comes to this level, because it is a very difficult thing to solve that is not going to be solved quickly, even if there was the will and the resources to do it. And that is the lack of civic education in this country, and how civic education has been gutted and continues to be gutted. And now we're seeing it in an even more dangerous respect, where Republican governors and state legislators are banning books, banning African-American history, as Ron DeSantis has done from the Florida public school system, literally erasing history, erasing true history, and not providing civic education about how government works, why government exists, why it's important, the difference between democracies and democratic states and non-democratic states, how privileged we are to live in a democracy in this country for as long as we have it. And my God, I hope we keep it. But that is in question today. And certainly over the next few years, I think 2024 is actually the most consequential election since 2020, because I don't believe that we have gotten out of this position of being up against people who really do want to tear down our democracy. And they don't have a plan for what they would replace it for, by the way. That always is the part that I'm like,
yeah, there are literally no policies other than create chaos and burn it to the ground. I mean, Carrie Lake is a good example of this, yes. Right? Where she is walking around telling people that she is the governor. I mean, as far as she's concerned, she won, and she's doing these like mini rallies in tents with enough people to make it look like she's got a following. And she claims that what she is doing is true democracy. And people are buying into it, and they're giving her money.
And that's the only reason she's doing it right now, because she knows she's not winning. The institutions have actually done their job. They have upheld our democracy, right? Our elections are sound. We've had some of the most safe and secure elections of my lifetime over the past few years. And so this narrative that is based in absolutely zero facts that they continue to peddle on the right is because it really ramps people up. It gets them to give money. It makes them feel represented because they have been told their whole lives that government is corrupt and that elected officials lie. And so I think about this with the insurrection too, the siege on the Capitol, all those people that spent money and time and took time off of their jobs to go to stage a violent attack on our Capitol, to put Trump back in office when he was not elected. What did they think came next? Yeah. I mean, they would never vote again. Trump would be, God of America forever. I don't know that they get past what they are being asked to do in real time. And certainly, I think that is really dangerous, because I do believe that there is a level of brainwashing, and there is just a lack of media literacy. There's a lack of civic education and literacy. There's a lack of history and context that's provided to people. And we have to solve that. And it starts in schools. And that is why we are seeing the biggest attack on our public schools, certainly of my lifetime right now in America, playing out in states all across this country, because they know that's how they start the indoctrination very young.
I do want to talk about education. I just have one more thing to say about Kari Lake and that kind of movement. And that is that how is it possible that you can have this kind of hypocrisy where you're like, elections are fraud, they're fake, don't trust them. There's Hugo Chavez is meddling with the voting machines. And then in the next breath say, vote for me, you've got to vote for me, please vote for me. It just... You have to be a whole new brand of stupid, right, to kind of see how those two things can work in parallel. I mean, does that mean that democracy will save America ultimately because fewer people will probably vote on the right because they don't trust the system, and then you'll just have more Kari Lakes claiming election fraud, and then it'll end up in the courts and it'll be proven that actually it was one of the safest elections in history? I mean, how many votes is it going to take? Because at this rate, Republicans will keep losing.
I had, I think, somewhat maybe of a naive thought on this after the midterm elections, where I thought maybe Republicans would really take to heart the lesson that it is a bad strategy to tell your voters and your supporters that the elections are fraudulent and that your vote won't matter, because they lost a lot of races they should have won, probably, based on the current information ecosystem that exists. And they didn't. And I think that you make a good point there. And then, however, we saw Kevin McCarthy let actual insurrectionists, and in my opinion, traitors of this country, onto committees and to negotiate with him in order for him to get the speakership. And so all of my hope that they would have learned any lessons about the dangers of these kind of communications that actually would prevent them went out the window, because they are willing to give up the entire ship to be able to have this power. And it's really, really alarming and very scary, because this is the most extremist Republican Party that I've ever seen. And they are now running the committees and the House agenda. And thank goodness that Democrats maintained the Senate, because, a lot of these measures won't come to bear because the Senate won't put them up for a vote or pass them. And yet they are going to continue to provide the media all of this chum of gossip and conspiracy theories and all of these things, because the press is, responsible for covering them. But it's going to turn into these narratives that really hurt Democrats and hurt Americans, because they are going to drown out all of the good factual information and things that government is doing on behalf of the American people, to be able to set the narrative for 2024, which again is an incredibly consequential presidential election here.
That deal that McCarthy did, I mean, just the visuals of seeing him like almost pick a fight with Matt Gaetz in the chamber, kind of goes up to him and people having to hold them back. And I mean, I was like, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, Tara. But this deal... And
you couldn't also tear away, right, Anthony?
Yeah, of course. The sensationalism, I was drawn to it. I was watching it on C-SPAN, so I know no network was earning money out of me necessarily. But I would say that the deal that got Kevin McCarthy the speakership involved getting rid of Adam Schiff, getting rid of AOC, getting rid of Ilhan Omar.
Eric Swalwell.
Like, that was the deal. And to me, and what they were saying on Thursday, which I thought was most interesting, was this is an attack on minorities. It's an attack on women of color. It goes back to that kind of the racism that is so baked into the Republican Party. And I don't really know the solution to this because, as I said earlier, it's one rule for one and another rule for the other. But at the end of the day, if you don't have Ilhan Omar on the committee where she was doing really good work with all of her experience as a Somalian refugee, and We need that. That is what the word representative does. It represents the type of population that are now living in the United States. And it's a great disservice to America to do these kind of short-term political games just so that Kevin McCarthy can put on his resume that he was once the speaker for 15 minutes.
That's right. Well, and that's exactly what it is these are games, and they're games that have massive implications on people's lives in this country, because they're the goal of removing these individuals from the committees is to get some quick wins to the people that Kevin McCarthy negotiated with, but also to the MAGA base in this country who don't understand probably what committees do. I mean that generally, right? Like, they're not actually talking about the work of the committees. They're just talking about like quick scores on the board, like where they're like, look, we got rid of these people that represent these things that we all hate and we've trained you to hate. And so it feels like a victory. It feels like they're like using their power against, wokeism or all of these things. And then it has real implications. And so it goes back to the fact that Republicans are not trying to gain power to actually run a functional government that serves the American people. And I do believe, and I am a deeply optimistic person, I have to be to do this work, you have to be, to keep believing in democracy in this country, that the American people, when they do, they continue to see the chaos that Republicans bring when they're in power, and the results that Democrats bring when they're in power. I think that's why so many Democrats won that maybe shouldn't have or wouldn't have in past midterm election cycles, because I think Republicans have gone too far and they are making a mockery of themselves in this process. And again,
it's a really good point. It's because it's almost like the circus has now come to town.
Yes.
And this is very much an example of how the Republicans would run the country if they had control of all three branches of government in 2024. Because, George Santos, I don't really like to talk about him because I think he's a bit of a flash in the pan and he'll be gone in a few weeks, erased from history. But he is an example of how low the Republican Party will stoop to get a win. A guy who just makes everything up, has a kind of false identity, and, who has supposedly got 2 brand new knees.
I mean, it is entertaining still, right? But this is good that that honestly, there is more attention being placed on people like George Santos and Marjorie Taylor Greene, because when they speak, I do believe that the vast majority of Americans, if they hear them, are not going to be on that side. Do not believe that those are people that should be representing them. And so it is. They now have power. What they do with it, as long as organizations like yours and Courier and hopefully some large media institutions that see this remind the American people and tell the story of what they are doing with their power. Because I really, and I think it's the same thing with the lack of trust now in the Supreme Court in this country, as they've become a political, ideologically run court on the right. And so I believe that the Dobbs decision actually changed the political dynamics of this country, as long as people continue to be reminded that it's no longer the threat to your rights. They are starting to take away our rights to our bodily autonomy, our rights to a safe environment for our kids at their schools, a right to go to a concert or a grocery store and not be shot and killed. These are things that we need to protect and continue to fight for. And it comes back to our general thesis of this conversation, which is communicating this information and communicating what they are not doing with their power when they're talking about things that don't affect the vast majority of people, and how those things are actually going to get done. And their agency in it. People need to be reminded that they have enormous amounts of agency in their vote and in their public service and their citizenship.
Because that is democracy, which is I don't even hear Republican representatives using the word democracy. And I've said this before, and I don't really make a big thing of it, but I think there's more to it than just semantics. But the word democracy is also the word Democrat, or from the word Democrat. And that makes democracy exclusive to the left. And that is my fear, is that maybe, people need to change up the names of these parties, because you could argue that really Democrats should be called constitutional Republicans or Democratic Republicans, because they care for the Republic. and they care for the vote. But Republicans are not Republican, and they're certainly not conservative. So isn't this part of the problem in the US where, people are very literal and they do like to compartmentalize? And actually, if we switch the names of the parties, then people might find that they've been sitting in the wrong place for the last few years.
I think labels are dangerous and problematic across the board. We describe Courier as a progressive news organization simply because our values have been defined that way. And I really struggle with that because we are not a partisan organization by any means. But
you're also not progressive, Tara. You're not. In America, you are.
Right.
But in the rest of the world, none of your values are progressive.
But even in America, they're not. They are popular. But it's true. We have really ceded the definition of these terms to the right. And I do believe because of Donald Trump more than anyone else, he has polarized the word democracy. He has made democracy a partisan word because only one party fighting for democracy and him with the big lie, and that kind of having this downstream effect in the MAGA Republican Party is a problem because we have to remind people. I mean, just this week, Republicans in the House put a vote up about supporting socialism or not to try to get Democrats to vote whether or not they support socialism. Like, this is theater, and it's the worst kind. It's not good theater. It's just they are playing an information war playbook that they have done for a long period of time. And it is scary because we do have to remind people what democracy is and how much they want it, how much they benefit from it, and how important it is that we protect. And I do think we saw that a bit in the midterms in 2022. I think people did come out for democracy. I think abortion was the defining issue by and large. But I do think seeing the overreach and seeing all of the election deniers and denialism, I don't think that sits well with a lot of people in this country, especially people who remember the stories of the generations that came before them, then brought them here, right? Like, no one is just American in this country. That's the beauty of our country. We all came from other places at some point in time. And the reason this country exists is to protect religious freedom, to protect freedom, and to have a capitalist society that enables opportunity for everyone. It's why so many people want to come to this country. But I do think that we have lost that civic literacy in large part because we have ceded that storytelling to the right.
So let's talk about education, because there are plenty of MAGA Republicans collecting Social Security who are campaigning against socialism, and yet they are very much signed up to a socialist construct. This has to start in school, doesn't it? We have to educate people from a young age to know that socialism is a function of, the military is a socialist construct as well as Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, as I mentioned. We need these things. These are the backbone of supporting people who have often paid into the system. This is actually the money that people earned and often put in. How do we start with young people? I mean, I have very young children, and my 7-year-old daughter told me the other day that she has to do the Pledge of Allegiance in school every morning. And I didn't know this because, I'm a useless parent. I do my best, but I just didn't know. I'd never been to a US school. And I was like, do you want to sing that? Because she's British, my daughter. And she was like, yeah, I mean, I don't mind. And I said, well, you do whatever you want to do if you feel like it's right for you. But they're doing Black History Month and they're doing, but then again, I live in California. So there are different things going on all around the world, all around the country. All I would say is I have no idea what my kids should be learning in school. I want a school board, I want educators, I want experts to decide. So it's not about me choosing, and yet we see parents campaigning in Florida to get books off of shelves because they think they contain critical race theory, and they seem to think that they are smarter than those who are trained to educate their children. I mean, I'll hand this ball over to you because I don't really know where to start with any of this.
It's it's difficult to know where to start because the attack on education in America is happening at so many levels, driven by the right. And this, again, gets to the polarization and the divided country that we really do live in. If you have a Republican governor, you have a Republican-led state house in this country, they are banning books. They are affecting they are making decisions, profound decisions that will have profound implications on what children are taught and what they are not taught. And also there is a there is an increasingly popular wave of attacks at public schools in general through school vouchers for private schools. We just saw this in Iowa. Our Iowa Newsroom, Iowa Starting Line has covered this debate and session in the Iowa State House, and the bill passed because it's Republican.
In the middle of the night, right?
Yeah, and no one in Iowa was requesting this. No families in Iowa. Public schools are the heart of communities in rural America and in states like Iowa. And it's coming with dark money from outside, from coastal billionaires and elites who have an agenda to promote private schools that they will financially benefit from. That's the short story. And this is yet being exported to all states that are run by Republicans, again, to attack public schools so they can control the education and, frankly, brainwashing of younger generations. And so it is incredibly important that we do everything we can to protect and bolster and strengthen public education in this country, not eliminate it, which is their end goal. And that there is, again, regulation. So have a fair shot of being educated with the truth. What's going to happen, and what is, I believe, the Republicans' intention, is that every child that grows up in a state that is Republican-led is going to have an entirely different conception, as we see older people who watch Fox News versus who get good information that is factual, where the divisions will only increase because they will have entirely different educations and understandings.
And indoctrination at a very young age is very dangerous. And we've seen that in religion, and we've seen that with cults, and we've seen that with organizations that are wholly unsavory. And so how do we, because my view is that we're going to end up with state warfare, where, as you described, different states will end up being entirely Republican or entirely Democrat. People will, over time, start to kind of move. And there has been a bit of a shift of people, relocating across the country to be with like-minded people. I mean, if your parents think a certain way and you have young children, then you are going to indoctrinate them, and you'll end up with this thing called hereditary voting, where your parent, my parents voted Conservative, so I voted Conservative when I was 18, first chance, and so that in itself is unfair to children, isn't it? But also lying to them about revisionist history is also not healthy either.
No, it's not. And parents are busy. Most parents have 1, 2, 3 jobs in this country, right? To keep food on the table and to give their kids good opportunities and a good life. And so it is not their job, to your earlier point, nor should it be, to also determine what is taught or what is not taught in schools. I think a lot of parents don't have the time to think about that, and so they're not also going to fight it, right? They might not even be aware if we don't make them aware of what's happening and changing in their school systems. But that is the point. That is their goal, is to indoctrinate from a young age, as opposed to provide a good education, right? The same thing we see play out in media is what's now happening in school systems and school boards and state houses when it comes to education. And it is terrifying. I will say I don't have children. I struggle with the idea of having children in this country because of all of these different things. But I really do think that the attention paid on education is important because, again, they are weaponizing parents' emotions. They are riling up parents' emotions. We're seeing this also on the insane attacks on trans individuals in this country in state houses that are led by Republicans and school boards, where they are trying to prevent people from being who they are in this country and villainizing and shaming and inciting violence against populations. So there is not a lot of good that is coming out of Republicans gaining power where they gain power in this country. And the education piece is so important, that we are getting those stories out and that they're coming from messengers that are trusted, that aren't just partisan media outlets or progressive, or frankly, politicians are not good messengers on this stuff for most people. So I
don't even hear people debunking the CRT argument. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene actually said it out loud in Congress a few days ago, didn't she? She had to explain to somebody who was on the stand, what CRT was. And she said, it's a racist ideology that's being taught in all schools, which is completely untrue. It's a module in very few select universities that is very difficult for people that want to go there.
And I believe in not one public school in this country could find any evidence of CRT ever being taught.
But maybe we should talk about CRT just for a second, because what they are actually describing is a conversation about African Americans, or trying to in some way make sure that the conversations are a little more inclusive, which teachers, I hope, are all doing, that people are not excluded in class, because it would be foolish to think that there is no discussion of race in class. And even in my daughter's class, she's in first grade, that she is coming home and having conversations with me about understanding where everybody fits in society. They're effectively using the kind of acronym CRT. They're purposely using it because there is no conversation about the detail of what is going on in schools and what should be going on in schools. And so there are teachers now in Republican states that are scared of being prosecuted, and so removing all the books from the shelves until they've been looked at by a, what do they call them, like a media analyst or something. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a mess, because the reality is that they're just seeking everybody in class to be white and Christian. That's their dream. But America doesn't look like that. So this is going to end in tears, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not going to end well. It's truly not. And, you just think about the strain that's already put on our teachers in this country. Less people than ever before want to go into teaching. It's not a fun job, as we've seen over the past number of years. They're not paid nearly well enough to be helping raise the next generation of Americans in this country. And then they are put in these terrible positions where they are scared of losing their job, to your point, are scared of being charged with a felony simply by reading a book that they have taught in their curriculum for 20 years that is entirely based on factual historical information. This is a war on our schools and our future generations by the right to indoctrinate them to their incredibly dangerous ideals. And the way that I have always come to understand how to fight back in this war is with your vote. We still do have a democracy. And like I said before, I hope that we keep it, but we have to know what these people really stand for. I was at a Bruce Springsteen concert. I was very lucky this past week for my birthday. And I was talking to this older gentleman when I was eating dinner alone, and we got into a conversation, and he was from New Jersey, but we were in Florida for the concert, and politics came up, as it tends to do with me. And he said, I'm not a Trumper though. I'm not a Trump. I was like, okay. And he said, but I love that guy, Ron DeSantis. And I was like, you love that guy who just banned African-American history from schools in Florida? And he said, I never heard that. Where did you get that information? And I showed him a bunch of news articles, and I said, where do you get your information? And he was not a Fox News watcher, but the circles that he runs in, the social media that he's on, have glorified Ron, right? Like, he is living in an echo chamber where Ron DeSantis is this machismo hero. And it wasn't that he agreed that you should ban African Americans' history, because he didn't. He'd never heard that. Right? That isn't the information about Ron DeSantis that is reaching people that could be supportive of him. And so again, it just kind of goes back again to how we get factual information out. I do believe the majority, I believe in the American people, and I believe that they don't stand with these extremists on these issues. But if they don't know about these positions or these laws that are being passed in Republican-led states, and they're only hearing good things about these people through right-wing media or their personal networks, then this is how we are on a race to the bottom.
Bruce Springsteen actually has a lot to say about this stuff, doesn't he? He's somebody who's just been singing for years, and he has a podcast with Barack Obama called Renegade, which I've really enjoyed. And you really get to hear somebody who you could argue is that kind of all-American with his, Fender guitar and he really gets it. He really understands. And I do like this notion of musicians. I mean, this is another way to reach people, isn't it? And Springsteen is a perfect example of somebody who could probably reach across the aisle. Born in the USA is a very patriotic song, right? And he's doing his best. Maybe he should have picked someone other than Obama to do a podcast with.
Actually, that's where I give him a great deal of credit, because I think too many celebrities are actually too scared about losing their fan base by becoming more political. But no one was more supportive than Barack Obama or Democratic candidates for years than Bruce Springsteen. He is unapologetic, and he comes out with those things, and he hasn't lost his Republican fan base because they love his music. They might hate his politics, but that does make him a really strong and trusted messenger. And also, again, I really, really applaud his willingness to do that with his superstardom, because I think if more people did, it would become more normalized for folks that these are not progressive values, these are popular values or positions. And what the right is proposing in this country and what they are espousing and standing for are extremely unpopular and extremist. And we just have to make sure that Americans know the difference.
I just want to make a final reference to a story that came out this week of the Associated Press got an exclusive audio clip from a senior member of Donald Trump's re-election campaign. Said that campaigners were going to fan the flame and spread the false claim that Democrats were trying to steal this election, referring to November 2020. I mean, this is, not that we needed proof to know that the whole, election fraud thing was the concept of it was a hoax by the right. But now there is even members of Donald Trump's former campaign staff who anonymously, because they obviously fear, being attacked personally, are leaking these tapes. I mean, if this is not an example of the right's kind of base crumbling, because there's a lot of talk about Donald Trump being now rejected by the right and how 2024 could actually look very different in terms of candidates to what we think. It could end up being Nikki Haley versus Hakeem Jeffries. I mean, who knows, right?
It is incredibly helpful and valuable and important when they say the quiet part out loud. Yeah. And I think that we are seeing that more and more. And to your point about this being leaked from someone, we're about to enter what I imagine will be an incredibly crowded, complicated, and entertaining Republican primary in this country. It's been slow to start, which has been interesting, but it certainly will speed up. And that provides a lot of opportunity for a lot of information to come from trusted messengers to Republicans in this country from other Republicans about the extremist ones. I hope that they can beat them. We saw that in some races, right? They have a real primary problem, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the party navigates it on the right. But I think that it is very beneficial when they increasingly feel comfortable saying the quiet part out loud, that they are lying, that they have an agenda, and that they are willing to do anything in their power, legal or not, to protect and advance that agenda. And as long as we make sure that that stuff does not get lost in the noise and that it comes through and it's reinforced, then I again believe in the American people's judgment when they go to the ballot box.
Okay. Thank you, Tara, seriously, for your time and also your crusade and your campaign. And I wish you all the best with Courier Newsroom.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It was a pleasure.
I'm Anthony Davis. Please subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5 Minute News daily podcast, which drops every morning so you can hear me tell you what's happening around the world while you make your morning coffee. Join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.